It's like we're playing tic-tac-toe with Kylie.
The Oklahoma Humanities Citizen 2020 initiative catalyzes community engagement with journalism and journalists and provides resources to better understand the role of the humanities and a free press in a functioning democracy. So, whether you listen and subscribe to our Brainbox podcast, read the expanded issue of our Oklahoma Humanities magazine, or attend one of our virtual Ask a Journalist town hall, we hope you enjoy these educational resources. This Oklahoma-specific programming is part of a larger national initiative called Democracy and the Informed Citizen. 46 other states, plus Guam and the Northern Marianas Islands, are all participating in this initiative administered by the Federation for State Humanities Councils with funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation.
Okay, I think we're live here. I'm Chris Carroll. I'm a program officer and the host of the Brainbox podcast for Oklahoma Humanities. We were really honored to be joined by three really great panelists for this discussion. I'll go ahead and let the panelists introduce themselves as well. Catherine, maybe we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Catherine Sweeney. I'm the health reporter for State Impact Oklahoma, which is a partnership of the state's NPR affiliates.
And how about you next, Paul?
Hi, I'm Paul Monies. I'm a reporter with Oklahoma Watch. We're a nonprofit investigative website. I cover mostly state agencies and public health.
And Dr. Gaddie?
Hi there, my name is Keith Gaddie. I'm on the faculty of the Gaylord College of Journalism at the University of Oklahoma. I'm mainly a book author, but I also periodically act as a news contributor to KGOU-FM, the NPR affiliate in Norman, Oklahoma.
Well, we thank you all so much for being with us this evening. The theme of our discussion is kind of how the pandemic is affecting election coverage, but the theme of this overall initiative is the role of the humanities and a free press in a democracy. So for our first question, I wanted to throw out to each of you. In a perfect world, what role should journalists play in a democracy? Maybe Catherine, we'll start with you.
So I was hoping the others would go first.
We can do that.
The one that I think people don't talk about as often is being an active historian, especially if you're doing very local journalism. When I was a city and county government reporter in Greeley, Colorado, I was the only person who was writing about us knocking down our city hall and building a new one, you know, all these new initiatives that were going into place that would be around for a very long time. And I saw kind of the future of that when I was researching, you know, the old city hall getting built. The only records of that were in the newspaper archives. And so I think that it's really interesting that we get to be these people who keep a record of these things that aren't going to end up in, you know, history textbooks. We'll talk about presidential elections and history textbooks, things like that, but we get to talk about more local issues and local history that won't be other places.
Paul, how would you kind of define the role journalists should play in a democracy?
I would say just in a perfect world, I mean, you're basically explaining and exposing wrongdoing, and you're documenting abuses of power. And that's abuses of power, not just by government, but by business or particular industries, people who have power over other people. So it's just basically trying to get to that level of engagement with people so they can make a better decision about who their leaders are.
And Keith, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I agree with both of these roles. I think these are the idea of crafting both the first draft of history and then chronicling its evolution, because stories change, which is something the public doesn't always understand. It's not just sitting there in a press release to be picked up and transcribed. That's not what journalists do. But also holding people to account. Journalists in a perfect world, in their perfect role, initially tell bad news. They initially tell bad news because there's good news all around us. In most lives, there's typically good news. And it's the bad news that instructs us on how to make things better. But the other thing is, the journalist's role actually is political and it is democratic because it's defined in the context of speech. There's a reason why when you go into journalism colleges, you find the First Amendment emblazoned on the wall. It's because we are here to act as advocates for the pursuit of truth.
It definitely feels like there's some confusion or bad feelings toward journalists in much of our citizenry. And I wanted to ask, what are some things that citizens should understand about journalists and their work that might help increase trust in the media?
I mean, I'll take that. I mean, basically, I would say that we have a responsibility to kind of put our best version of the truth out there, and if we're wrong, correct it. And when I say truth, I don't mean just like objective truth, like the sky is blue today. I'm talking about the best available facts that we can gather in the time that we have, and it's a continuing, it's an evolutionary process. I mean, if we have new facts, we'll change the story, we'll update it, we'll get an update to it. That's why whatever you see in the news today is probably going to be a little bit different tomorrow because the reactions are different from somebody else. We'll get new information in there. And I mean, I think it goes back to Catherine's point of that first draft of history, where, we have to be quick, but we also have to acknowledge our mistakes. We have to acknowledge that we may have biases that may enter into that story and that coverage that we have to then correct if it's brought to our attention.
Catherine, what do you think is something that citizens should understand about your work that they might not?
So I think that I would say there are two things that I wish that people understood, one about the work and then one about the people. For the work, I think that a lot of people have started really disliking when journalists put context into a story, or they analyze the facts of a story. They say, you should just give us the facts. But a lot of the time, you don't really understand the situation if you don't have this analysis or this background information that somebody who's been covering situations like this for a long time would be able to give you. And so just as an analogy, if I said, a son inherited $100, that might sound like a lot, but if his brothers got $10,000, the depiction of somebody getting $100 in their inheritance is a little bit different. You have to know all of this background, and providing background and deciding what background is relevant, that is open to interpretation, and I can see why somebody would be irritated by that. But I think that it's more of a job of a journalist to tell the whole story and not, just kind of be obsessed with this idea of like, I have to appear objective. One of the best pieces of advice I got from an editor once was, a lot of people will tell you your job is to say, man A said it's raining outside and man B said it's not raining outside, and who's to know? Your job is to go look out the window. And so that kind of context, I think, is really vital, but it's something that people will always label as bias, and not always, but some. And the people who look bad with that extra context will always throw the fuel on the fire saying, oh, that's just bias, that's just their opinion, when it's not. And so I think that I wish that people would understand how pivotal that context is, and then how weaponized sowing doubt in that context is. If I have something to lose, of course I'm going to say, don't trust these bad things about me, especially if they're true. The other thing that I wish that people understood is how different journalists are, outside of DC and New York, everywhere else. I think that people get this idea that everybody went to Columbia Journalism School and they all have rich parents and they make a ton of money and they live in some high rise and they all work at the New York Times, and that's how the mainstream media is. They're a bunch of out of touch ivory tower people. When outside of there, I mean, we all grew up where you did, right? I'm from Oklahoma. I think a lot of us are. We live in the heartland. We're in your community. And journalism really doesn't pay very much. My first job made $25,000 after requiring a 4-year degree in internships. So that's pretty typical for an entry-level job in this field. It's not, you know, some lucrative, fancy gig. And I think that a lot of resentment with the media is coming from this idea that they think they're better than us because they're so fancy and they're, you know, yeah, living in these ivory towers. And outside of major cities, that's really not true.
I think I'm getting a misapprehension of that from watching journalists on the news and seeing their homes in the background, seeing national journalists with spectacular apartments. I think I'm guilty of having that misapprehension. I'm glad you mentioned that. Dr. Gaddie, we're so glad to have you here to give kind of a scholarly perspective on these issues. I wondered what's something you think, what are some things you think citizens should understand about journalists that might increase trust and understanding of the role of the media?
Well, the first thing I would say is everything that was just said about journalists, we could strike the word journalist, put in the word university faculty, and get pretty much exactly the same problem, the same answers. I think what people need to understand is that we need more journalists, and we need more serious journalists who can take time and develop stories. And I think that the public doesn't always understand, especially for broadcast, which is the type of journalism that a lower information consumer is most likely to encounter. Reporters don't have a lot of time to dig into a story and don't have a lot of time to develop it. And they also have very, very little editorial control and very, very little ability to persuade those who have editorial control to allow them to do the proper type of reporting. They want to be doing the serious stories. They want to be doing the lengthier stories. They want to be doing the ongoing stories, but something caught fire in Edmond and we need to watch things in Edmond burn, right? Because when Edmond burns, it's near the TV station, so we have to watch it. Sarcasm font. But we need more journalists. And I think if the public understood the impact on the old brick and mortar and legacy journalism outlets that the economy has taken in the last 20 years, and that we're having to transition to a not-for-profit model for journalism, and that journalism in many ways will end up either getting more partnered with higher education and not-for-profit foundations, or simply not existing. Those are the choices. You have the national networks for sports, you've got local news for weather, but who fills in the stuff that actually affects your life, where you can't go look out the window? I don't think the public understands how strained the industry is right now.
Could you give us, Dr. Gaddie, could you give us a few historical examples of how journalists have been challenged and how they've responded to, specifically to covering elections in times of great crises, times of upheaval, like what we're living through today?
Well, you know, we've never had an election under circumstances like this since 1864, when we held an election during the Civil War, right? With active combat going on in the country, we held an election. And an incumbent president won, Abraham Lincoln. So we've had uncertain environments where, you know, if you go back to 2008 during the depths of the Great Recession, at the onset of the Great Recession, we have this disruption that occurs basically a month before the election that completely is a game changer for politics. But for the journalists, their role really was still covering the campaign, covering the response of the parties in the campaign. The ability to cover the campaign didn't change that much. And I think this is actually an unprecedented environment right now. I don't think we've ever imagined trying to cover a campaign that doesn't take place physically, right? Where everything that happens in politics is taking place in other circumstances. But I mean, so Paul, you were in Tulsa, right?
That's right. Yeah, I was up there at the Trump rally.
Yeah, and you think about it, you were asked to go into a high-risk environment as a journalist to cover a political event. And the only other time we ask journalists to go into uncertain high-risk environments like that are either social disruptions that lead to violence, right? You know, sort of like the protests we've seen lately, which journalists have also been out covering and getting injured, or war. And what do journalists do? Journalists have to disconnect themselves from the fear and step in and be the eyes of the public where the public can't go. So Chris, I think it's rather unprecedented, but I think for journalism, this is not unlike a war footing where you prepare to go into combat, you prepare to go embed. You are encountering people who are highly stressed, but journalists today confront another challenge, and then I'm going to pass the baton, which is we've got more competition from ideologically charged outlets on the left and the right that masquerade as serious journalism. And I think that's the biggest challenge contemporary journalists confront that we haven't seen since the days of Hearst.
Well, Catherine and Paul, I did want to ask you, just kind of generally speaking, what impact has the pandemic had on your work in the last several months?
Paul, why don't you go first? I've been monopolizing.
Well, for sure. I mean, my preference in any kind of reporting is to talk to people in person. That's my number one goal for any kind of interview. I would much rather talk to you in person than do a phone interview, a Zoom interview. Email interviews are the worst, back and forth. I mean, I would much rather talk to you in person. You get much more body language, you get much more understanding, you get much more comfortable with who you're talking to. And so just for me, I'm mostly, or pre-pandemic was mostly based at the Capitol in the press room, covered legislature, but not on a day-to-day basis, but paying attention to it day-to-day. And so just missing those interactions in the hallways with lawmakers, with policymakers, with lobbyists, with fellow journalists even, and just kind of swapping, the standard gossip that you'd expect, the standard information you'd expect during the session for sure. So definitely, I mean, that cut in March where we basically all just went to virtual press conferences, virtual, meetings for public meetings and public bodies, you get less of an idea of, I mean, it's still helpful. I mean, technology has been a great kind of way to get into that if you can. I mean, it's definitely allowed me to stay at home and cover a public meeting I would probably normally go to. So it's made me a little lazier in that respect, but I still miss out on that interaction just personally. And some of that is coming back. We're seeing some meetings with, people masking and social distance, but I mean, definitely that's been the biggest change. And that's not unique to journalism. I mean, every other industry, profession, person has dealt with that in the last 6 months. And so, but definitely as a journalist, you're always, it's an information back and forth. You're never out there just grabbing, you're giving too. And so there's always that give and take that you don't always get in a Zoom meeting that you might just be paying half attention to on something else,
For me, in an immediate sense, logistically, it's been wild. I have a background in newspaper journalism. I've always been in newspapers, but I've been transitioning to being a radio reporter, and I'm learning how to be a radio reporter, miles from any radio station. So I'm learning how to be a remote radio reporter, which is very different, and learning how to produce sound and record it in a way that doesn't sound horrible, and learning how to read scripts in a way that's professional, without my boss anywhere near me or my coworkers there to say, hey, how does this work in audition? Or, hey, how should I pronounce this word? Or, what's standard for XYZ? They're not there. And so that's just been really weird. I think that, a year into my job, I'll enter a sound booth for the first time. That's pretty different. But that's just kind of funny. But I think that the pandemic has also, for a lot of journalists, done what it's done to a lot of other problems. It just kind of exacerbated something that was already there. I think with any journalist position, you have two kind of opposing needs. You have this need to cover these daily breaking stories, things as they develop, just things that won't take a week to write, they won't take a month to write. You need to get them out now. It's not going to be valuable tomorrow. You got to get it done. And then there's the long investigations and the analysis pieces. And that's already a pretty hard balance to strike, especially if you're covering, a state house where things are happening all the time, or if you're covering crime or something like that. The coronavirus has, thrown that into hyperdrive, because there is something to write about multiple times a day, every day, for this whole thing. You have all these people dying, you have strain on hospitals, you have new case counts, you have trends in those case counts, you have an epidemiologist saying this, you have, you know, the state medical association saying that. Like, there is constantly breaking news to be covering, and you have to decide when to stop that and say, okay, but I really need to look into how the coronavirus is making our nursing shortage worse. How do I do this thing where I take my foot off the gas and sharpen the axe, and where I write about these, you know, more underlying ongoing stories? I think that it's making that pretty difficult for a lot of people, definitely myself.
Hmm. I know all of you have lived and worked in other states beyond Oklahoma, and I was curious, I wanted to ask if there are some kind of particular challenges that you think we face here in Oklahoma, challenges covering the pandemic specifically.
I mean, I can go ahead and say, I mean, I've worked in several other states, in Texas and Missouri and Washington, D.C. area. I mean, the thing about the pandemic, it's obviously a global story. It's a pandemic. It's a national story. There's a ton of national outlets looking at this, but at its heart, I mean, it's a local story. I mean, all these things are happening to our friends and neighbors in our, you know, cities, our zip codes, our neighborhoods. And that is where the positive information comes from. There's not, like, the New York Times is not coming in every day and doing a story about Oklahoma. They'll come in once, maybe a quarter, or there might be a national news outlet from, you know, CBS or CNN coming in. But, you know, we're all here every day, and we feel that pressure, I think, to make our friends and neighbors knowledgeable about what's going on around them. And I don't think that's specific to Oklahoma, but I mean, I think that's just where the level of journalism we're at here, where we're kind of basically covering a global pandemic, but in a very localized way. And a lot of that has been, and I'll just, you know, say from the beginning, has been getting data from state officials in a consistent way that makes sense, and makes sense to people to try and explain what's going on. And so I think Oklahoma's public records laws are pretty good, but just in terms of like how officials are interpreting them sometimes, I have probably had better experiences in other states I've worked at, but I've never covered a pandemic in another state. So I know that, you know, Oklahoma was good and bad at times on data release. I mean, we were first to kind of discuss actual by nursing home, you know, the incidents and by the staff too. And we were, you know, among the first states to kind of get that out there. That they're still fighting on that by the midsummer in some other states to get that information out. So, I mean, there's kind of the good and bad. And when you compare states, you know, I don't think there's been a perfect state response in all of this. I mean, it's hard. I mean, we're all learning as we go along. It's a pandemic. It's a new virus that has no cure yet, no vaccine yet. And so I think we're looking at something that, you know, I think that you do have to have a certain level of, I don't know if it's grace or just humility, and like, you know, you're not going to have all the answers, and the public officials don't have all the answers, and we're all kind of struggling along, but they do have a responsibility to inform people and to, you know, give stuff that makes sense, not just give it or withhold it reflexively because they've always done that. And so I think that might be a difference that could be state to state.
Catherine, have you experienced any particular challenges in covering this issue in Oklahoma?
I'm not sure that I would attribute any of it to Oklahoma, you know, as a state. Paul really touched on how this is just tough for anybody. And Keith really touched on how Oklahoma just doesn't have enough journalists. So that makes it pretty tough, but that's also true anywhere. One thing that I think might be a little bit tough is we did just have, you know, a gubernatorial election not super long ago. So we don't have like long-standing relationships with a lot of these agency heads. And that's not the fault of anybody, that we just happened to just get a new governor, you know, but I do think it would be a little bit easier if we, you know, we're in the end of a second term for some governor and you've known the spokesperson at the health department for 3 years, and, you know, you know the agency directors for all these agencies. I think that would just be a little bit easier, but that's not really anybody's fault. It's just how it worked out.
Keith, you think, broadly speaking, are there kind of unique challenges in Oklahoma to journalism?
Well, I think Catherine's brought up a very interesting point that dovetails off of what Paul has said, which is that we've got this populist state constitution, which really fragments executive power all over the place. We have 8 different state elected elected executives. We have all these boards and commissions for all these agencies. Agency power is hyper fragmented, and you've got turnover in agency heads. And what this is a consequence of the distrust of expertise by the framers of the state constitution 120 years ago. So the consequence is, when you wrap that up along with having term limits in the state legislature, you're always rebuilding relationships. You're always having to rebuild and rebuild and rebuild. I mean, I think I had the entire state legislative leadership in class 20 years ago. That's how young it is, okay? And having to constantly recultivate those relationships, that puts a lot of demands on journalists. But it also means that the people in charge of the agencies are constantly rediscovering what they've gotten themselves into and the limits of their scope of power and ability, because they have some board that they're having to deal with that they didn't anticipate. So I think that is more of a problem here in Oklahoma. It was also a problem in Louisiana. It's a problem in Texas. But if you go to other parts of the South or to the West or even to the Northeast, you get a different environment where state government's a bit more professional. But I've actually been impressed with the changes in information delivery and information accessibility that have come at technology change in this state. And I think the last 2 years have been very good for us in that. So we have to see how it plays out. But it's a consequence of who we are and how we govern ourselves, and the fact that we don't trust anything that's too expert. Yeah.
I would add to that too. I haven't worked in a state like this, but I have several friends who live in states where their state legislature operates full time. And I cannot imagine like how much more interesting or helpful it would be when we're talking about policy response to this, to be able to talk to the Health and Human Services chair after a meeting, you know what I mean? Or if they were responding to this in real time, but they can't really do anything right now. They're out of session and they're not going to come back for a while. They might have some interim studies, but they won't be taking official action until February. And that's unique to Oklahoma.
Well, Catherine and Paul, I was curious, in your day-to-day work, have you encountered much resistance to accepting the truth of your coverage of specifically of the pandemic? Like, has the charge of quote unquote fake news ever been thrown at your work? And what do you think is the best way to respond to that?
So I've been really lucky to avoid that. If you listen to public radio, you probably trust media, to be frank. So if I worked at a TV station, I have friends here who do, the way that the public interacts with a TV station like KOCO or News 9 is very different than how you respond to your local NPR affiliate. And so, I mean, I follow them on Twitter and I see their tweets or their Facebook posts, and they are just getting browbeaten, and I just have missed it. Like I just haven't gotten that same level of vitriol at all. But we have like a little group chat, and they're just like, great, I'm posting the death count today. We're posting the new case counts. We're getting ready for all the comments, and I think that everybody has a little bit of a different philosophy on that. But I just think that some random girl on Twitter is not going to change someone's mind about hating the media. And so there's not a whole lot you can do. Like, sorry, but just get through it, I guess, is usually what I say, which I guess is not very helpful, but it is what it is.
Have you encountered that charge, Paul?
I mean, not in my daily reporting. I get some questions, or some folks will respond on my Twitter. I mean, I kind of draw a line on social media where, like, I'm on Twitter a lot, and it's mostly professional basis and some random silly comments I'll have every now and again. But my Facebook is pretty much dormant. I mean, I'm on there. My wife posts and tags me with pictures of the kids, which I think is great, but I'm not getting on any political discussions on Facebook. I'm not even doing that on Twitter. But the way I kind of look at Twitter is like, I don't really care if some random guy is calling me names on Twitter, because it's not really like they're my friend like they are on Facebook. It's a little more personal thinking on Facebook when someone's lighting you up, I think. But I did kind of feel that a little bit. I mean, Keith mentioned that I covered a Trump rally up in Tulsa. And so I was up there in the arena for 6 hours with my colleague Keaton Ross, and we were in there, and we had 2 of our reporters and photographers outside covering the rallies and the protests. And we were all wearing masks. We're all being very careful. And just as a kind of recommendation, public health officials like, if you went to the rally and were inside, go get tested. So we all went to, all four of us went to get tested the next week, and I came back positive, which I was deeply shocked and surprised by. I had no symptoms whatsoever by that Friday after the rally. And so I was pretty open about testing beforehand. You know, I had a short video on Twitter about me getting the swab test up the nose, which is unpleasant but not painful. And so I was trying to at least show a little bit about like, hey, this is not so bad that you kind of might expect. And so after my positive, I shared it, and then I immediately got like a lot of well-wishing, hope you're okay, blah, blah, blah. But there was a decent amount of like, well, you're just fake news. You're trying to make, you know, you went to the Tulsa rally and got COVID or spread it up there. And I had to turn those comments off. I took a little break from social media. Obviously, we as a family had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And luckily I was asymptomatic the whole time. My wife tested negative 2 times in that 2-week period. But I mean, I went back recently and looked at the comments that I turned off, and it's just out of this world. I mean, it's nothing I wanted to pay attention to, and it didn't really bother me because I had turned it off, but just knowing that that was out there after the fact was just kind of strange. I mean, you know, it's one of my, you know, we don't even have 15 minutes of fame anymore. It's like my 15 seconds of infamy on Twitter, being a reporter covering the rally and coming back with a positive case, which, you know, luckily I was fine from that. But it's a weird place to be as a journalist, to be part of that story. And so it wasn't really any hardcore vitriol. There's some of the trolls you just kind of light up and just kind of retweet and say, look at this guy, this is crazy, and just go on your daily, you know, reporting. But I mean, if you go down that rabbit hole and, you know, think about it too much, it's disturbing, but yeah, you kind of have to push it aside and say, this is a hazard of the job. I mean, at the rally itself, there was multiple times during the rally where, you know, President Trump or other people speaking would talk about the fake news, and the whole crowd would go, and yell at us in the media pen in the middle, and just kind of wave and go on. I mean, you just kind of have to take it like that. It's at that point, it's more of a sport than anything. You know, if you came up and talked to someone afterwards and actually had a conversation about maybe politics, there's a lot of folks that are not, you know, that like black and white on a lot of issues I think about. But, you know, on Twitter, it's just a perfect outrage machine, essentially.
Yeah, it's funny, Chris, a dozen years ago, I was doing AM talk radio up in Oklahoma City at a few different stations. And I would get emails at the university that would be part of this outrage machine. And my personal favorite is people who do not know how to use English language. They write, "You are biased." You know, I am biased. I am biased manifest. I'm not biased. I am biased. So good to meet you. But the thing is, a friend of mine who was an FBI agent, when I started getting a couple of death threats, he said, "Keith, if they were going to shoot you, they'd just shoot you. Ignore it. Don't worry about it." And so when it came to social media, my advice to my friends who do sports talk is, you cannot engage the people that comment. You do not listen to the comments. You don't read them, you ignore it, because this vitriol is actually probably more vicious in sports radio and in sports Twitter right now than anywhere. And the politics have followed it as well. And it's just, these are the guys who get drunk and yell at the umpire. These are the wrestling fans who are yelling at the ring. And Paul, you went to a wrestling match in Tulsa. That's what happened. If you think about it, you went to a WWE event. And we have to accept that for what it is. And, you know, it's chafe that's out there, but these people didn't read the story anyway. So we have to continue to put the news out there for everybody else, and put out the commentary and put out the analysis, because, you know, it's a dangerous life to be a journalist, and it's become more and more dangerous, but that's because the job's important.
Well, Catherine and Paul, I'm curious, are there some really important key aspects of your coverage of the pandemic that you think are not getting enough attention? Is the public not paying attention to certain things you would like to highlight more?
I mean, I would just say, I mean, we're at a point now where we're, at least in Oklahoma, over 1,000 deaths, nationwide over 200,000 deaths. And it's hard, and I know it's nobody's fault, but we don't have any names or faces with a lot of these people. And unless the families share their stories with us, it's kind of a nameless, faceless epidemic of death, especially among people who are older than 65. It's more than 80% of the deaths right now. And a huge subsection of them are people who came from nursing homes or long-term facilities. And we just, it goes back to the point where we don't see the humanity a lot of times in the extent of this epidemic. I mean, the cases are a separate issue. That certainly is more, there's a big chunk of the middle cases that's 18 to 35, and they are luckily a little more able to deal with this and have been a little more responsive to just their own immune systems and recovering fine. But I mean, and that's not necessarily my coverage. I mean, it's an ongoing frustration. We put that so-called COVID box score out every day on like cases, active cases, hospitalizations, positivity test rates. And that gets to be a drag because there's always a death component there. And you never want to miss sight of that's a family with somebody who's missing now because of this. And maybe a comorbidity, that's beside the point. But I don't think people get it from an overall level, but they don't get it from we haven't seen those stories of, post 9/11 of profiling every victim, post Oklahoma City bombing of knowing everybody's story. Those families obviously have suffered and their loved ones and friends have suffered, but we don't get it as covering it in a journalistic basis that we've seen before in massive kind of casualty situations.
Why do you think that is? Why are individual stories not being told as widely?
I think part of it's the volume and the period of time right now. I mean, and it goes back to Keith's there's just not enough journalists to tell those stories, unfortunately. I mean, you see the obits in the paper that the families are writing, and they're great, but I mean, you don't get that mass, kind of media impact of that obit going to a wider audience. And so I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just thinking that's just an undercovered part that probably makes people feel like this is not as serious as it is at sometimes.
Is there an aspect, Catherine, in your coverage that you think is not receiving the attention it should?
Not necessarily in my coverage. So I'm going to kind of echo the sentiment that Paul is talking about, where it's just not getting covered enough and there's nobody to blame. I myself am implicated in this, but I think that one thing that hopefully we will start to get to cover more, maybe as fingers crossed things die down at some point, is how this kind of exposed a lot of our structural inefficiencies in our public health system and our healthcare system and our social services system, and how this really just shined a light on a lot of the underfunding we have in our hospitals and our public health system, and how it made response to this more difficult and how that manifested. I think that we're going to be able to write more about that as time goes on. But I wish that, I wish that we all, including myself, could focus a little bit more on that. Not to be crass, but, in campaigns, in political campaigns, editors will tell you to stop covering the horse race, the daily, here's a number, bam, 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 and focus more on what are these long-term issues, or, how does their messaging on this reflect who we are as a country right now, or who we are as, a congressional district. And I think that that's the kind of work that we really need to be focusing on. It's just so hard to, when you go from 700 deaths to 1,000 deaths in what feels like no time, and all of a sudden, we have 1 million people who have been tested, it's really hard to balance that. I talked about that a little bit at the beginning. And I look at my own stories, and I wish that I had more of this structural approach. And that's something that I'm trying harder to address.
If I could jump in, Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message, right? And this is a bad visual story. It's a bad visual problem, and our dignity makes it bad and hard to cover. We offer to people who are suffering a degree of privacy under federal laws that govern medical information. We're not unless names are reported. We don't know who these people are. We don't see the funerals. We don't see the flag draped coffins, right? So we don't have we don't have the Dover account like we would have with war casualties. It's a bad visual story, and that makes it hard for the public to grab hold of, because we don't have the compelling singular image that drives home the difficulty of this thing, and just the sheer magnitude of it.
We have a question from one of our viewers, and I'd like to encourage any of our viewers to send in a question, however you're viewing this. One of our viewers asks how the profit model of journalism might affect what stories are allowed to be, she uses the word allowed to be covered. Could you talk a little bit about the profit model versus a nonprofit model of journalism? I'll throw that question out to anyone who wants to pick it up.
I mean, I can take that a little bit. I mean, I've worked in both worlds. Right now I'm working nonprofit journalism, but I spent 15 plus years in for-profit newspapers, essentially. The profit model in commercial journalism has, at least on the newspaper side, this is my experience, has been broken for a couple of decades now, at least. We've kind of got to the point where, I respect everybody that are still working in daily newspaper journalism, because that's where my start is. As I pick up daily newspaper every day, still read it in paper form, but it's such a hard commercial prospect now to make sense. I mean, you've got, the whole issue even before the financial crash, 2008, 2009, of like, it was already being, the commercial, like classified information was already being pulled away by, Craigslist and the free ads online. And then basically the whole, your daily local metro paper was almost like a department store where you could go in and get anything that you needed, or a grocery store, anything you needed. And sometimes you don't want the spinach, sometimes you want, the candy. And it had all of that. And it's gone, that whole business model has been split off by the internet. And it's not, the internet has been great for disseminate information and have new business models come up, but like for newspapers, it just blew them up. And, we as a country I think are probably gonna have to have a reckoning of like, how do we fund public service journalism, in the next couple of decades, because, we've now seen the rise of hedge funds coming in and like, taking these newspaper companies and picking their parts up and going on, and everyone, there's more layoffs. So, I mean, not that the nonprofit model is the best model out there, because there's issues with that. I mean, you are reliant on large donors sometimes, large foundations. You're reliant on lots of small donors too. You're basically hoping that people are seeing a value in what you do and willing to pay something for it, even if they're not getting a discrete product like you would go to a grocery store anymore. And I'd like to say I have a ton of answers to fix this problem, but I mean, I think it's mostly like we have to have an awareness of, just because you see a story somewhere else on some other media doesn't mean it came from that media. It was probably picked up and reported by a local outlet at first, and then aggregated and sent on its way, put on Facebook, put on whatever other site, and then the end user really is kind of disconnected from that production side of it. And I'm somewhat hopeful that I think the demand for news is still there. People still want to read about their environment and what they're doing around the community. It's just paying for it. It's broken. And, until we figure that out, and I'm not saying just we, I mean, I think just as a society, we've got to see what the value in kind of locally produced news and paying for it in some way, whether that's donations or whatever else. It's an interesting question that I don't think has an answer yet.
I think the question, mine won't be very long, but the question kind of focused on like how your publication's owners affect what you're allowed to cover. I think that that's an interesting question. And I think that 15 years ago or 20 years ago, that would have been a lot more pertinent to what people are allowed to cover. We've really moved away from these like families whose last names everyone knows owning the newspaper. You know what I mean? We don't have, back in the day, the LA Times, the owners just sat around chewing on cigars and attacking their enemies in the newspapers, or, they protected their friends on the other side of the, downtown or whatever. And I think that I can see, I mean, I have friends who've worked in newspapers for a long time. There are things that people can tell you, we were told not to write about this, or like, the undertones were there, sometimes overtones. But one of the very few good things that I think has come from these just mega conglomerate corporate owners is they are not invested in stuff like that. Gannett doesn't care if you write about Chesapeake, like they're not invested in that. And so that they do create their own problem, though. A lot of these mega corporations, they don't care if the paper is profitable or not. I was working at a paper that had its biggest year, adjusted for inflation and everything, of profit that it had ever earned, and we still had a layoff that year because it didn't matter. The money goes to the shareholders, not to the journalists, not to the publications, and so what you're allowed to cover, I don't think is affected the way it used to be, but what you're capable of covering is affected in a way that we couldn't have even imagined 20 years ago.
This goes back to where we started, which is we need to rebuild our infrastructure, and we don't know how, because the internet broke the monetization model. It broke the advertising monetization model, and it especially killed print and then secondarily radio. Radio was depending on a 40% margin to fund things. And that's why Clear Channel went bankrupt, or whatever they became, My Heart, is that they were banking on this excessive profit margin to feed their stockholder need, as Catherine pointed out, and they've never recovered from it. And if you look around, the best quality journalism being done in a lot of mid-sized markets is not-for-profit journalism and public radio journalism, because they can invest in infrastructure, they can invest in stories in the long run. It would have been fun to have had Trace Savage here also from NonDoc, because Trace literally built it, from nothing. And it'd be fun to get his take on this particular question, because he struggled to keep the doors open for years until he caught fire.
And they have a mixture of large and small donors, I think, that support them to allow it to be a not-for-profit venture at this point, I think.
Yes.
Well, we have just a few minutes left, and I did want to ask some questions about how the pandemic specifically is affecting the upcoming election and coverage of the election. I'm curious, have you seen some shifts in the way candidates are approaching the election, given the pandemic situation in Oklahoma?
I mean, nobody's holding big rallies other than the president, right? We have a major congressional race going on in central Oklahoma, and there's no rallies for it. How weird is that? I don't think that there's been any time where that would be the case, where they're not having, a chili cook-off and meeting people all over the district and going to t-ball games. That's really weird.
Yeah, it's strange because when I first moved here, I started going out with politicians 20 odd years ago. They said, Doc, the thing you have to remember is in Oklahoma, they like to see you sweat when you campaign, because it was all retail politics, door to door. Larry Dickerson, the old state senator from down in Poto, told me that one. But it's, that's not there. It's not available for us. But, living down here in Norman, we had this recall effort that came forward, which required signature gathering and it required going door to door. And it's really interesting how this community has gotten polarized over pandemic politics and how it then manifests as a campaign. And what we discovered is a lot of the tools we had secondarily, voter identification, voter targeting, phone banking, text banking, internet contacting, has taken on added importance. The one thing that's still working well is fundraising. Fundraising is doing okay. Because you can still dial for dollars, but it is not a primary contact, watch them sweat campaign anymore.
Yeah, and I'll just add. I think early on in the pandemic, there was still people obviously we had filing back in April, I think, for office, and at that time it was very early in the pandemic. Nobody knew exactly what was going on. And you kind of saw some politicians we're kind of joking, maybe it was half joking or not, but like this is me, my video going out now. I'm full like gown, mask, everything, out, and then like grabbing like a stick to ring the doorbell from 6 feet away. I think we've probably got a little more, I don't want to say used to things now, but like you probably have more people willing to go out and talk to people on the doorstep wearing a mask. I mean, I'm always very wary of anybody coming by my door if I'm at the house. I'm doing, a lot of my work from home, and I often wonder separately on door-to-door salespeople, how they kind of approach this kind of job. They still need to get out in the community too, but it's the same kind of retail stuff. You've got to go meet people where they are, and the state fair is not going to be held this year. I mean, that's a big place for parties, at least to organize and outreach and that kind of stuff. I mean, some of the state petition gathering stuff put on hold, just fell apart because they were not allowed to or could not gather signatures to. Norman obviously is a little special case there that's a very, that was a motivated bunch of folks that went out there and had a very short period of time to kind of collect signatures. But I mean, I think we've got, maybe more virtual town halls with folks on, I don't know how you hold like something 600 people on Zooms, but that was kind of a thing before the pandemic. You had people doing the telephone conference kind of town halls like that as well. But yeah, it's an interesting time right now, especially kind of looking local races and kind of state legislature races.
Oh, sorry, Keith, I think you're muted.
Go ahead, Chris. I'll hold off on my comment. I'd rather hear your question.
Oh, well, I have a very unfair question, really. So I will go ahead and throw it out here since we're close to the end. But I was curious, just generally, what is your level of confidence that this election taking place during a pandemic will go off without a hitch? Or what sort of problems do you foresee?
Do you guys want me to take that one? That's the kind of question that Catherine and Paul usually ask me.
Yeah, I would not like to answer that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm happy to take this one on. I spent 14 years as an election law litigation consultant, so I've been on the practical side of fair elections before. I would say this, I do worry about having the election go off, but it has nothing to do with pandemic. The reality is that the absentee ballot and early ballot mechanisms and the mail are more than capable of managing a heavy mail voting election. Okay, we are more than capable of handling this. We know how to do it. That's one. Two is you don't have to have all the ballots counted on election day for them to count. It isn't like Cinderella's slipper and it has to be off her foot by midnight. Okay, we have plenty of time to count ballots. We have military and overseas voters who have to have a period of time to get their ballots in. So we've always had rules to allow for absentee ballots to come in late. What we do have that is coincident to pandemic, Donald Trump and his backers should be very pleased that the globe gave them a crisis to do what they wanted to do anyway, which was to cast doubt on the integrity of elections. This playbook was going to be run in any event, and now it's being run. And the biggest job journalists have, and we are doing it both in state and around the nation, is making the public understand how their elections work, what the individual voter's obligation is, what the obligation of the state is to the voter to help them vote. That's the biggest thing that we are capable of doing. The system's up to it. We just need the public to be patient to let the system run. You want to kill cancer in one treatment, but no, you're going to have radiation for 25 days, okay? It takes time to get a count right with 150 million voters. It'll be fine if the public will be patient. And we have an executive and a political party, a political movement, not a party, a movement that isn't content to let the public be rational, reasonable, and patient.
Keith, can I ask just real quick on a follow up on that in terms of comparing to what happened in 2000 with Bush and Gore? I mean, there was an extended period of time in one state. I mean, are you talking there could be extended period of time in multiple states this time around?
Yeah, it could be an extended period of time in multiple states, and the question is going to be, it'll be multi-pronged. In some states, it will be, we need to do a recount of the ballots because the vote is very close. And remember, states regulate elections. The national government has an exceedingly limited role, which is in guaranteeing access to the ballot under the Voting Rights Acts and under the 14th Amendment. That the national government actually has a very limited role. So what it's going to be is about, in some states, it'll be about recount. In other states, it will be about the timing of absentee ballots coming in. In still other states, it'll be challenges to absentee ballots. And if you were an election law lawyer or a voting rights expert witness type, there's going to be plenty of work in December and plenty of opportunities to litigate, more than likely, because every tool in the toolbox is going to get deployed this election, more than likely. So yeah, you could be looking at a situation like Florida in multiple states and probably very large states. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin are the logical targets. Wisconsin's difficult because they have local election board control that is not well managed and has variable standards. Wisconsin's always a mess. So yeah, short answer is yes, Paul. Yes, absolutely. It's going to happen a lot. It's going to happen everywhere.
I think we have time for one last question that a viewer has sent in specifically for Keith, but I'd be curious if you could all address it. How do you think history will tell the story of the coverage of the pandemic?
Well, I intend to write it. And I think the story of the coverage is going to be quite good, because it will be the story of an effort to explain an emerging science and an emerging reaction around the world under different models of governance to a mutually held threat. And it's going to be the story of how different political actors were covered articulating arguments for how we should respond and being wrong, and then attempting to recoup and regain their footing in the midst of a highly contentious environment in terms of economy, race, economics, economy, race, generational change. Generational change is the story that underlies all this that needs to be told. Young America and old America don't look alike, but I think history will have a very good time writing this, and will write it well, in part because the journalists have done a great job of laying the foundation, as Catherine explained at the top of the hour.
Catherine and Paul, you're writing the first draft of history. Would you like to take a stab at how you think history will look back on this period of journalistic coverage specifically?
My answer won't be as educated as Keith's, but it will probably be as optimistic, and maybe too optimistic. We'll see. But I am hoping that the journalism industry as a whole will benefit from the reckoning it had after 2016. There's been a million think pieces about how they just screwed up everything about their election coverage in 2016, and how they just weren't resilient enough against a lot of bad faith arguments. They let people blow them around in the wind. They, parroted things they definitely shouldn't have. They weren't critical of themselves in real time, stuff like that. I mean, all of it. And so I'm hoping that a lot of that prepared us for where we are now, where we are hearing things that aren't true, that are not misleading. They're not, they're not spun. They're lies. They're blatant lies sometimes. And I think that pre-2016, a lot of reporters were very reluctant to ever use the word lie, to ever use the word false, to ever say this is true and people are saying it's not true, instead of two sides can't agree on whether this is true. I think that we were forced to learn how to do that in a way that's a little bit better. And I'm hoping that empowered a lot of reporters to be able to call a lie, and a falsehood a falsehood.
Paul, would you like the last word on this?
I mean, what Catherine said was just everything that I was thinking about in terms of we've kind of come through 2016 and are now dealing with not just politics, but pandemic and science as well. And I think the science part of that, especially in the public health realm, it didn't used to be a political issue. I mean, you think back to the basic responses to something like the coronavirus, where there's no cure, there's no vaccine yet. And you're going back to the same models that we had in 1918 for the flu pandemic then. Basically, put a mask on, keep your distance. And Keith could probably talk to this a little bit too. I mean, back then you had anti-mask leagues. You had, you know, the whole issue of like quarantines, you know, targeting specific communities and people of color and ethnicities and stuff like that. And so, you know, we as a society have come through this before. I mean, that's why I'm somewhat hopeful in the broad sweep of history. You know, there's good actors, bad actors. There's people just trying to figure out as they go along. But I mean, I think history will kind of show, hopefully, that, you know, we've kind of, you know, maybe not given our best foot forward, but at least half a foot forward and maybe half a step back at times. But you know, we'll get through this. And you know, it's been terribly tragic and sad for a lot of folks who are affected directly and deeply by this. But I mean, you know, I just come back to like we're all muddling through on something that's pretty brand new to us anyway. And I just think to my kids, I mean, I've got a 5 and a 6-year-old. They will never forget going to school in masks ever, their whole life. They can tell their grandkids, hopefully, about that. And it's like, you know, me talking to my grandfather about his service in the war in World War II. I mean, that is something that we all dealt with as the world and as the globe together at the same time. And you know, it's an interesting time to be living, but you know, they say that every period of history. So.
Well, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Catherine Sweeney, Paul Monies, and Dr. Keith Gaddie. I hope our viewers will join us next Thursday for the next installment of this series. We'll be talking about Indigenous media, the history and some really fascinating current issues in Native American media. That'll be October 8th at 6:30. So thank you all again for joining us. And we really appreciate it. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure to be here.